event coordinator, and welcome to Terasem Movement Inc.'s 8th annual workshop on geoethical nanotechnology. Please allow me a few moments to go over the tips and hints that appear on the right screen. Only the presenter will be advancing the slides on the presentation screens, so please resist advancing the slides. Unless you are the presenter, please do not engage your speaker or voice chat control during the workshop. Only the speaker should have their voice control active. A Q&A session will follow each presentation. Questions are limited to the text box found in the lower left toolbar. The presenter will address only those questions appearing within the chat history box. A moderator may assist to ensure, if time permits, that all questions are addressed by the presenters. Presenters, please make certain your cell phones or other signal-emitting devices are either turned off or sufficiently away from your computer during the time your microphone is engaged. Failing to do so could cause interference with your audio. And to everyone, please keep in mind that these proceedings are being recorded. Thank you all, and I'm wishing everyone a wonderful workshop experience. Now, please allow me to introduce our moderator and our host, Dr. Martine Rothblatt, aka In-World Vitology Destiny. Martine is the president and co-founder of Terasem Movement Inc. Let's all please welcome Martine.
Thank you, Lori, for that warm introduction. I just feel so fortunate to have you in charge of organizing this conference and just doing such a great job with all of the organizations. So I'd like to point out to everybody the screens up front. I have a few convening slides that I'd like to show, and I thank Lori Darling for organizing these convening slides and getting them up here and presenting them. So the first question I'd like to ask is, why do we even have these workshops on geoethical nanotechnology? Why on July 20th, and why by Terasem? Next slide, please, Lori Darling. So as most of us know, July 20th is when we first landed on the moon in 1969, and now we are 43 years after that, and that is such a momentous event that we'd like to continue celebrating it. In terms of why geoethical nanotechnology, technology has two faces, friendly and not so friendly. Next slide. It is very helpful to have technology. It really has made civilization worthwhile for us and been very beneficial for the vast majority of people. But sometimes it causes problems. And next slide, please. These are examples of some of the problems. Next slide. Next, there we go. So one way to avoid the problems are to have rules. Here there are rules on how to handle fire. And the rules allow us to have the benefit of the technology while minimizing the risks. Next slide. We have rules governing activities in space. It's called the law of outer space. And thus, instead of getting a war in space, we've had a peaceful development of outer space. Next slide. We have numerous countries cooperating on the International Space Station instead of thermonuclear explosions in space. That's because we have geoethically managed the development of near-Earth space. Next slide. The key words in the Outer Space Treaty are to have due regard for the interests of all others. That's the key principle of geoethics. Whatever you do, have due interest for the due regard for the interests of all others who might be affected by your activities. Next slide. So my hope is that this conference will similarly result in us being able to deploy nanotechnology in a way that has due regard for the interests of all others who would be affected by it. That's what we mean by geoethical nanotechnology. That's what we've been pursuing for the past 8 years and will continue to pursue until we really see that we have helped birth self-replicating nanotechnology into a realm of geoethical considerations. Next slide. Terasem is the host of the conference because the Terasem movement's fundamental goal is to get life off of this planet and spread it throughout the galaxy. To do that a way that celebrates diversity, but keeps everybody working united toward the same goal rather than fighting with each other. And we believe geoethical nanotechnology is essential to spreading civilization throughout the galaxy. Next slide. And here you see the basic principles of geoethical nanotechnology. We'll talk about those more as the symposium proceeds this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are. Next slide. And now it is time for me to introduce our first speaker. It's Peter Wicks, who is currently on sabbatical from Science and Environment Policy Interface at the European Commission, under which Peter has served from 1996 to 2011. Though from England, Peter lives and works in Brussels. His interests are hosting a forum entitled The Future of Humanity. He is also very interested in the European Foresight Platform and in the Institute for the Emerging and Evolving Technology, for the Evolution of Emerging Technology, IEET. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Peter as he presents for us on the title of Technology and the Environment, Enemies or Allies. Peter, please join me at the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Martine, and thank you to Laurie especially for helping me. 3 years ago, I did not have an internet connection at home. 1 week ago, I didn't have a Second Life avatar, so this is all very new for me and also very exciting. What I want to talk about today is about the relationship between nanotechnology and emerging technologies more generally, and the environment, and in particular about the community of people that we tend to call environmentalists, whether people working in government, whether NGOs, whether simply concerned citizens who are worried about the environment. And what I want to get at is the extent to which there can be a community of interest between those who see the benefits of technology and those who want to protect the environment, or whether these will always tend to be seen as opposed. Now, has my second, oh, there we go. What you see on this slide is a press release from Greenpeace. I'm sure you all know Greenpeace. It's maybe the most famous environmental NGO in the world. In this press release, which they released last October, they welcomed a decision of the European Court of Justice, which is somewhat analogous to the US Supreme Court here in Europe, who had upheld Greenpeace's challenge concerning the patentability of stem cell research. And as you can see, the press release reads as follows. Greenpeace welcomes the decision that cells derived from human embryos cannot be patented, as patents on such cells would encourage the commercialization of human embryos. Now, if you are like me, I was working in the environmental department of the European Commission at the time, and when I saw this, my first question was, what does that have to do with the environment? They seemed to be worried about commercialization of human embryos. They seemed to be worried about ethics, about people playing God, all the kind of concerns that you hear from so many people. But what was the environmental dimension? What was an environmental NGO doing trying to block the patent of stem cell research? Just as a little bit more background information on that case, it was actually a case that they brought in Germany, and it was the German courts that referred the case to the European Court. Now, while I was preparing this presentation, I was eager to see what environmental NGOs are currently saying about nanotechnology. And I dug out this from the Environmental Defense Fund, which is, I would guess, the main NGO in the US on the environment. And, well, I'll read out exactly what they said. Nanotechnology has great potential to deliver environmental and other benefits, but it may also pose significant risks to human health and the environment. And they go on to say that government and industry should work to identify and manage possible health risks before new products are widely used. Now, clearly, this particular NGO is paying at least lip service to the fact that nanotechnology has potentially enormous benefits, although you may notice that they don't actually use the word enormous. But I think you'll probably agree with me in saying that the emphasis here is very much on risk. Environmental NGOs seem to see more risks than opportunities in nanotechnology, not only to the environment, but also to human health. And they propose a collaboration between government and industry to manage those risks before products are widely used. So they really want to slow down the commercialization of nanotechnology in order to deal with the risks. Now, I assume there is nobody in the audience today who would disagree that there are risks as well as opportunities involved in emerging technologies, including nanotechnology. But still, the question in my mind that has been brewing in my mind for the 16 years that I worked in the Environment Department at the Commission, the European Commission, was why is the emphasis of environmentalists so much on risks when it comes to new technology, and rarely more than lip service paid to the potential benefits. And this is the main question I want to try to answer today, and to come up with some reflections on what those of us who tend to see benefits more than opportunities might do to close the gap between the techno-progressive community and the environmental community. So I'm now going to try to advance the slide. There we go. So the basic answer to the question that I want to explore today is a historical one. I believe that the relatively hostile attitude towards technology of many people who are concerned about the environment has its roots in the origins of the environmental movement. And as you can see from this slide, and you can see from Wikipedia, you can see very easily from the internet, the roots of the environmental movement are very much in the 19th century and in the Industrial Revolution as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. You've probably heard of the term Luddites. These were the people that actually vandalized the new industries that were springing up in England and Germany as a result of the Industrial Revolution, because they felt, with some reason, that industry was spoiling the environment and ruining living conditions for many people. And it was. The fact is that there was a lot of hardship and a lot of environmental degradation caused by the industrial development of the time. Now, if we fast forward through the First and Second World War, when it's probably fair to say that people's minds were on other things, we see further developments in environmental consciousness, which, as you can see, remains very much associated with technological risks. There was the nuclear testing in the Bikini Atoll, which made people start to be aware of the environmental and health risks, not only of nuclear weapons that had been developed with such catastrophic results in the Second World War, but people thought even more generally. Then there was the iconic book Silent Spring, which was particularly concerned about the chemical industry and how chemicals that were being released into the environment as a result of industrial development could even lead to the destruction of nature, the silent spring being a spring where there are no birds left to welcome the spring. And then the Torrey Canyon as an example of accidents and disasters that have to this day continued to mar the development of industry and associated with environmental degradation. Now, at this stage, environmental awareness was still something of a fringe movement. It wasn't really mainstreamed into the language of politicians. It wasn't a very big scientific focus. It hadn't found its way to a great extent into legislation or to really popular consciousness. That started to change in the 70s and 80s. The Club of Rome is an example of a development which brought together politicians and scientists to start taking a really close look at the environment. But it was always still with the idea that it was basically industrial development and new technologies that posed the greatest threat to the environment. It was as if every new technology that came along posed a new threat to the environment. And indeed, during the 80s, we started to become aware of new risks, not just the air and water pollution that we had been aware of before, but things like depletion of the ozone layer, acid rain, and of course what everybody talks about today, climate change. And then finally, as technological development started to accelerate, and genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms, started to be developed and commercialized, there was a huge backlash, which is, I would say, even stronger in Europe than it is in the US. And environmental NGOs were very much in the vanguard of opposing such development. The word that they like to use for this is frankenfood. I just need to... Okay, there we go. Sorry about it. So that's, for me, the main reason why the environmental community tends to be rather hostile to technological development. It has its roots in a movement that was created in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. What is interesting, though, and in some respects more positive, is that as the environmental movement has matured, one starts to see contradictions. And one of the biggest debates within the environmental community is whether the idea is to value nature for its own sake, or whether we should be trying to aim to create a healthy environment for humans. They don't even talk about post-humans. Most environmentalists have no idea what that even means, but they at least debate, are we talking about nature for its own sake or a healthy environment for humans? And depending on which side of the debate they're on, they will either tend to see humans, Homo sapiens, as something like the pinnacle of creation, that is to say, the traditional Abrahamic way in which certainly Western culture has tended to see ourselves and our relationship with the rest of the planet. Or they go to the other extreme and see Homo sapiens as a kind of cancer on the face of the planet, something very destructive, and something that nature would be better off without, rather tending to forget that nature actually created us. You can probably tell which side of that debate I'm on, but the important point is that there is that debate going on within the environmental community. And over the last 2 or 3 years, as climate change has come into focus as the main environmental topic of political and public attention, an environmental community that has traditionally been entirely against nuclear power, partly because they sometimes don't really make the distinction between nuclear power and nuclear war. And of course, because of events like nuclear accidents like Fukushima and so on, they have started actually to debate whether, after all, they should be less negative about nuclear power, because at least it's carbon neutral. So again, one of the questions being asked, is nuclear power a solution to global warming, or is it some kind of deadly avatar of Armageddon? I wanted to put in the word avatar in at least once in my presentation. You may be surprised by the next point, because you might think that wind farms would be absolutely loved by all environmentalists. But one of the most famous environmentalists, James Lovelock, for example, has lobbied against a wind farm in his native part of England because he thinks it spoils the countryside. And other people have complained that birds have a tendency to fly into the wind turbines, and it's therefore bad for the local environment. So even something as apparently benign and as environmentally friendly as wind farms are seen as vandalism by some within the environmental community. So if we take these various debates together, then what we can see is a question mark within the environmental community, which is very much reflected in the debates that I participated in the European Commission, even amongst environmentalists, whether we should see technology primarily as a friend or primarily as a foe. Okay, I'm just, Laura, if you could just help me to, okay, I've got it. Now okay, so, okay, this slide was just to give an example of how some environmentalists take a refreshingly positive attitude towards technology. And this is from the WWF, which certainly where I worked in the Commission was seen as one of the more responsible and moderate environmental NGOs. And it's just a little anecdote here to show that the WWF was supporting an example of new technology that was using solar power to run a boat that runs entirely on solar energy, which recently visited the Galapagos Islands. And this I just got from their website, but it shows that the environmental community is not monolithically opposed to technology, but there are some signs of hope that it can take a more balanced attitude. So the question that I want to explore now, and which I will be very happy to discuss in the Q&A and in the informal interactions later, is what this might mean for the kind of positions that people who, as I say, tend to see the advantages more than the risks involved in emerging technologies, including nanotechnology, what kind of stance we should be taking when we think about environmental issues and when we talk with people who are concerned about the environment, many of whom are likely to be very skeptical about new technology. And the first thing that came to my mind when I asked myself this question was that concern for the environment needs to respect human aspirations. This is a debate that I've actually been having recently on Facebook and face-to-face with some of my former colleagues who have been rather on the line that the planet would be better off without human beings, and well, perhaps it's okay to breathe, but that's about all we should be doing. We should be taking care to reduce our environmental footprint, and that tends to be very much the focus. And my problem with that is that it just doesn't respect human aspirations. The fact is that human beings want to do great things. They want to feed their families. They want to have exciting jobs. They want to travel. They want to explore new horizons. And an environmentalism that doesn't respect those human aspirations will not engage the kind of inspiration and creativity that we actually need either to deal with our environmental problems or indeed to do all the other things that we want to do. On the other hand, in case we are tempted to feel superior to environmentalists that are rather skeptical of technology and tend to see it more as a risk than an opportunity, we do need to respect and understand that technology also has its negative aspects. It has done harm as well as good. It is potentially very disruptive. Some people benefit from it much more than others. For many people on this planet, it probably would have been better if we hadn't developed technology. There is a case to be made that technology does harm as well as good. A related point, but which is nevertheless slightly different, is that sometimes people's opposition to new technology is simply a result of fear of change. And it's easy to, again, feel rather superior to people who are opposed to technology essentially because they're scared. Of course, nobody wants to admit that they're scared. But first of all, we need to understand that that fear is real. It exists. And they don't disappear just by saying that people shouldn't be scared. And to some extent, it's also legitimate. People are not obliged to want to live in the very weird future that is being created by accelerating technology. So fear of change is a legitimate concern. Another thing that we need to understand and apply to ourselves as much as to anybody else is that human beings are not rational, and we cannot expect human beings to be rational. So people will be scared. They will try to justify their fears by exaggerating risks, by inventing risks that aren't really there, or simply by arguing in very bizarre ways. And we have to expect that. We have to be patient. Human beings are not rational. We are not rational. They are not rational. And finally, of course, not only are there negative aspects of technology, but there are genuine risks. As I say, I doubt there is anybody here who would disagree that there are genuine risks, but when arguing with somebody who seems to see only the threats, it's sometimes tempting to forget there are risks, and we need to keep that in mind. So you may be wondering, having worked in environmental policy for 16 years and being able to empathize as much as I do with people who tend to be opposed to technology, why am I even in favor of technology? Well, part of the answer to that question is simply that it's very exciting. But there's a more serious reason to that. And that is that, put very simply, without technology, we're lost. And by technology, I mean soft technology. Not all technology has to be employ the latest with science. but also the really radical technologies such as nanotechnology. Whether you want to live forever, whether you want to be resurrected via cryostasis, whether you want to live multiple lives and direct many entities with a single consciousness, whatever new technologies mean to you, or whether you simply want to protect the planet that we inherited from nature, we need technology. We cannot do without technology. Technology for me is nothing more and nothing less than the product of human endeavor and human ingenuity. So again, coming back to the idea that concern for the environment must respect human aspirations, it must therefore respect the idea that ultimately technology has to be the answer. So in summary, I believe that nanotechnology and other emerging technologies can be an ally to environmental concern. But in order to ensure that that happens, we need to understand and to some extent empathize with the genuine concerns that environmentalists and others have, while of course emphasizing the need to respect human aspirations and the need to look to technology as the answer. So that is my presentation. I thank you all for your attention, and I'll be very happy, as I say, to answer questions and engage with you during the formal and informal interactions. Thank you.
Anyone has questions for Peter, please limit them to the text chat box on the lower left side of your screen.
Well, I'll reply to Eskatoon Magic, who I know as Julio in real life. Julio says that I know what my comments would be, but Julie, I'm very eager to hear them nonetheless and debate with you here on Second Life, as we've been doing, especially at IET. So I'm going to read out a comment from Mihai Kujet. Apologies if I haven't pronounced your name correctly. You say we need to respect life and that taking nukes into space and gas mining. I've lost the comment now, but I think I understand that comment to mean that technology. It's also the responsibility of those who support technology to show that it is actually something that is good for the planet and good for humanity. And that is, of course, a point very well taken. Somebody has asked me if I don't like Homo erectus. Well, yes, I would like to see some Homo erectus around. If we can manage to resurrect some, then why not? Natasha Kodo says, don't you mean nanomedicine? Perhaps you could maybe clarify that question. Then there's a question from Fortino. Should we call fear of change legitimate? I believe it is not always legitimate. I'd like to respond to that. It's an excellent question. Of course, it depends very much on what you mean by legitimate. Okay, Natasha, I see that wasn't directed at me. Fortino, yes, I basically agree. Fear of change isn't always legitimate. It's certainly not always healthy. In fact, I think a lot of people tend to be very paralyzed by fear, and it can be very destructive, and change is what we fear more than anything else. But I also think that we do actually need fear, because fear is what makes us aware of risks, and in order to deal with risks and to avoid them, you of course have to be aware of them. And so I think this is something that we can actually welcome. The fact that people find change weird, they find it unsettling, this can be healthy. So for me, it's not so much a question of whether we welcome fear of change or wish it wasn't there. It's more a question of what people do with it. Are they focusing on real risks or imaginary ones? Mohian asks whether I said something about nanotech and technological unemployment. The short answer is no, I didn't, primarily because it's not what we would traditionally think of as an environmental issue per se. And it's not something that environmentalists tend to focus on a lot. It is, of course, a very serious issue. I did mention that technology can be very disruptive. There are always winners and losers. But it's not something that the environmental movement tends to focus on specifically. In fact, in a way, it would be better if they did, because at least they would be focusing on real risks.
Peter, to access a previously asked question, just scroll up within your chat box.
Okay, sure. Have I missed some, Laurie?
One from Natasha. It starts with, sorry, that comment was not for the speaker.
Okay, sorry. Yes, okay. Thanks, Laurie. So the question is, what methods do you suggest we enable to verify the personal position of the ethicists who are determining rules and policies for nanotechnology and ensure that they don't use their political and/or religious view to determine objective principles? This is of great concern. That is, for me, a fascinating question. It's something that I've been starting to grapple with as I've increasingly looked at the ethics of emerging technologies over the last year or so. I think, from my perspective, I mean, just to reveal my cards here, I had a Christian upbringing, but I don't consider myself to be religious. And my view on ethics is essentially utilitarian. But I'm also very much of the opinion that ethics and morality is not something that can ever be entirely objective. It is not something that you can derive from science. It is something that inevitably involves an element of choice. And this is something that one needs to recognize. I think we need to have the debate with people of all shapes and sizes, political, religious, or other. I think what we need to do essentially is to try our best to smoke out any beliefs or attitudes which seem to be non-evidence-based, or where people are using evidence as a kind of proxy for their own preferences. So, for example, when I say that my ethics is utilitarian, it's because that is the ethical framework which I find most aesthetically pleasing. And I don't actually pretend that it's more than that. And I think the more that people recognize that that their ethical frameworks are inherently subjective, I think the better we are going to be able to come to a genuine consensus on these issues, which for me is the most important thing. Brian Viper says that the general public's ignorance of nanotechnology and emerging technologies is disgusting. I don't disagree. Whether one is disgusted or not is as much a question of temperament as much as anything else. But the bottom line is, whether we're disgusted or not, it exists. And I think part of that ignorance is willful, because basically if you're scared about something, then often you just prefer not to think about it. So again, empathizing with the fear of change that underpins so much of this reticence, which, by the way, I think also underpins a lot of religious attitudes, is also a way to combat this ignorance. As cartoon magic tells us to screw evidence, well, that's a point of view. But it's not, Julio, that everything has to be evidence-based. But what I would say is that it's not evidence-based. Then if it is a statement about objective reality, then it's probably going to be false. And if it's a statement about preferences, such as finding your doggy sweet, then use the language of preferences. Don't try to claim that it is more objective than it is. I think that's what I really mean by saying that our beliefs should be evidence-based. It's not that everything is about evidence, but if it's not evidence, then it's that we're making some kind of aesthetic choice. Zobed Zuma says that you're not sure that it's reasonable to expect the public to be educated about a technology that is still mostly hypothetical. Well, actually, I mean, the public is educated in various ways, for example, via the movie industry. Maybe that's not always the best educator, but I think it is possible to be educated about the possibilities, even to the extent that they're still quite hypothetical and speculative. SSK Chapter asks, how do we overcome the challenge regarding the political powers that always strive to protect the status quo? Why can't they even seem to deploy basic things like solar energy? I think fear of change, vested interests. How do you overcome it? I think the more that we manage to close the gap between those of us who are pro-technology and those of us who are fearful of technology, but because they care for the environment or similar things, the more we will be able to combat the vested interests. So it's another reason to try to make our peace with environmentalists, even those who can be frustratingly opposed to or simply ignorant of the possibilities that technology has to offer. Extropia says nanotechnology is not a technology, but an entire field of technological capabilities. Think of how many inventions fall under senti-technology. Quite so. I mean, it's that's absolutely right. But what I think we can do with people who basically, for whom it's nothing more than a word, and a rather scary word at that, is to just give some examples of the kind of things that these different nanotechnologies have to offer. But of course, you're right, it's a vast area. Julio says everything is an aesthetic choice. I disagree. I think I can't turn the sky purple by wanting it to be purple. I think some things really are about evidence, but much is aesthetic. I think we can agree on that. Natasha asks if it is advised that all participants in the discussion debate are forthcoming about their moral, religious, political views, a more viable outcome is possible. I absolutely agree with that. I think the more transparency, the better. My only comment would be that it may be better to try to coax them to be more transparent rather than to insist that they are. But I mean that's a reaction. I'm not particularly certain about that. Mihai says epigenetics and nanotechnological enhanced and sustained consciousness coupled with quantum computers that do not need cooling will bring us the deeper understanding of the dynamics of life and especially the dynamics of evolution. Yes, but what an environmentalist will say is it will also lead us to some kind of Promethean Faustian pact with the devil, and we will simply destroy what nature has bequeathed us. And again, we just need to understand that those perceptions exist, and they're not entirely without a foundation, because I think there are a lot of futures in which that does happen, and we need to make sure that we actually use this knowledge, the understanding of the dynamics of life and the dynamics of evolution, to actually realize our aspirations and not create some horrible dystopia, which of course is also possible. Natasha asks, how do you suggest we might develop or build a team to establish the logic or rationale of supporting nanotechnology? How might we become involved? Natasha, I'm not sure who exactly you mean by we, whether you mean Terasem, whether you mean people at this conference, whether you mean techno-progressives generally. I think, I mean, there are so many ways to become involved. I think one of my favorite philosophies of life is that you should work out what you do best in life and what you love the most, and focus on that. So that's maybe a rather generic answer to your question, but I think everybody needs to basically focus on what they're best at. Okay, I'm just scrolling down. Mokian says in the US there are several educators such as Mikio Kaku, DeGrasse Tyson, who in your opinion could be a European communicator. That is an excellent question. I don't have an immediate answer. I think there are a lot of questions. What I would say is maybe we shouldn't focus only on single well-known personalities. Let's try to crowdsource this one. Let's try to use the social media, and let's be viral about it. Let's really just each of us work on the people we're closest to. And I mean, I very much see this event as a networking opportunity. I would like to make a lot of new friends here, and let's just work together to educate people and educate ourselves about the possibilities that the future holds. Brian Viper asks, what age do you think it's important to learn about the concepts of nanotechnology? I'm going to answer that by saying in the primary school, but after they first learned mindfulness technologies. That the closest thing I have to a religion is mindfulness. I'm a big fan. I mean mindfulness in the sense of Western psychology rather than Buddhism per se. But I think if we want to steer ourselves towards the best possible futures, we need to learn how to master our own thoughts, our own emotions, our own urges, and that probably needs to come first. But I would suggest that learning about nanotech, it should start at a very early age. Maybach Q suggests that we learn to program. Yes, I do have a mathematics background, but it's a long time ago. But I know a lot of people say that programming is the skill of the future. So good luck to you. Okay, Mal Burns says the biggest fear is less the progress of technology in our lives, but the technologies that might enhance or coexist with our human selves. Do you think such changes are inevitable? If so, will we suffer from a more major resistance than we have seen so far? I don't like to say that anything is inevitable. I prefer to see everything as a matter of choice. That, to some extent, maybe goes to Julio's point that everything is aesthetic. I think such technology will be very difficult to stop. Personally, I don't want it to stop, but I think what puts a lot of people off about new technology is the sheer weirdness. When you really start to understand what possibilities technology has to offer, you realize just how weird the future is going to be. And I think there is something to be said for keeping the technological pace of progress at least to manageable levels, if we can. Extropia says the changes are inevitable if humans are to survive indefinitely. At some time in the future, the solar systems and later still the universe will not support humans in their current form. I sort of agree with that. As I say, I dislike the idea that anything is inevitable, but basically I agree with you, and it's basically underpinned that the last point I made in my presentation. Technology has to be the answer. Because, as you say, the solar system, the Earth will fall into the sun, or the sun will explode, or climate change will make the Earth inhabitable, or whatever. We need to have pretty radical technology to get through this. Duan Buck asks whether I agree that the speed of all this evolving is getting faster and faster, if not exponential. I think it's more than exponential. And yes, I'm sure that it's getting faster and faster. And that's very exciting, but it's also partly what creates the risk, because the question is, will we have the wisdom to deal with that technology in an appropriate way? And this is why I think that mindfulness skills are so important. Philippe Golding says that from a realpolitik point of view, how much clout do environmentalists really have to actually stop or slow down major developments? I think to stop or slow it down, probably very little, but to be quite disruptive, or to be an ally in helping us to address the risks and actually to make sure that we actually have a natural environment that many of us want. I think they can be a very powerful ally. So we should not overestimate them, but we shouldn't underestimate them either. Maybach asks me if I'm aware of Ray Kurzweil. In fact, it was looking at The Singularity is Near. I just came across it in my local bookstore, and that's what got me into this whole transhumanism, techno-progressivism thing as recently as 5 years ago. So it's quite a new thing for me. I was an environmentalist before I was a techno-progressive. SSK Trapdoor says, I understand that average IQs are rising over the last 2 decades. Other polls state that our current generations are less prone to care about the environment or synergy. Seems like a paradox. This is something that I'm also very much in two minds about, because sometimes I hear that the younger generations are more environmentally conscious. Sometimes I hear that they're not. I don't have kids myself. I'm 45 years old, so bottom line is I don't really know. Yeah, it's I think social networking can be very important. There was an article on IET that went up a day or two ago about slacktivism, which is basically people sort of clicking or liking a page and thinking that they've done something, and questioning whether that really reflects a genuine commitment. So I guess the truth is that the jury is out. I don't know, but it's an important question anyway. Philippe Golding asks whether I personally aspire to an indefinitely extended health span. Yes, I do. I sometimes find it quite difficult to understand people who don't. I think they're making a virtue out of necessity. I don't have cryogenic insurance. That's one thing that I haven't yet got into. But if you ask me, would I prefer to live 1,000 years, 100 years, 10,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, then I'll go for the highest figure you can give me. Philippe also asks me whether I self-identify as a transhumanist publicly too. The answer to the first question is yes. It's something that still feels a bit weird to me, to be honest, because as I say, it's recent. I was an environmentalist, scientist, well before, more or less liberal or social democrat, well before I'd even heard of transhumanist, but it is something that it makes sense to me. And well, I mean, I blog and comment quite publicly, but it's something that I'm quite coy about in my immediate social environment, because a lot of people find it very disturbing. So probably not as publicly as I perhaps could be. Mihai comments that more than cleverness, we need humanity. We are not machines. Yeah, humanity. Yeah, I mean, humans can be really horrible as well as being really great. So for me, it's not so much humanity as wisdom and empathy that I think we need. Extropia expects lifespans to be dramatically extended, but wonders whether we should really say our goal is immortality. I think it's very much a personal choice, whether you want to be more ambitious or whether you just want to say radical life extension. My preference is to say immortality, why not? But I'm also aware that I might get run over by a bus tomorrow. So one has also to enjoy the present and not only care about the far future. Maybach points out that nanotech has been used to construct 3D printers for in vitro meat, and combined with quantum mechanics can bring up virtual reality tanks or helmets that connect to our neurons. How exponential is the speed of nanotech to get us to these levels. Well, how quickly will we get there? To be honest, I would say your guess is as good as mine. I know that a lot of transhumanists, a lot of futurologists probably put 10 futurologists in a room and you'll get 11 different answers to that one. As I say, I would say your guess is as good as mine. Philippe comments that death should remain an elective choice. I would modify that. I would say that death should become an elective choice. I think at the moment it isn't in most cultures seen as an elective choice, and I think it needs to become an elective choice. That would be my opinion on that. He asks, how should indefinite health span extension be democratized? That's a very, very good question, and it comes back to the wisdom thing, it comes back to the morality thing, it comes back to the aesthetic thing, and to choice. One difference between the US and Europe is that the US on the whole tends to emphasize more individual freedom and the ability to create wealth and to profit from the wealth one has created. Europe tends to be more socialist. It tends to be more about ensuring that everybody gets a fair share of the pie. I think there are pros and cons. I personally think that what we need is a balance. You need to have some pioneers, and you need to have to tap into people's selfish motivation, because otherwise they won't do anything. But on the other hand, you need to redistribute wealth, and you need to ensure that technologies are reasonably evenly distributed. Julio mentions that Europeans get wealth by other means, for example, corruption. That's right. Although, Julio, I don't think we Europeans have a monopoly on corruption. I think that is actually a global phenomenon, sadly. Mokian points out he sees the interaction between nanotech, biotech, 3D printing, and similar techniques as disruptive of the present economy. What do you think will be the outcome of this paradigm shift? I actually think that's the wrong question to ask. I think the question we need to ask is, what do we want the outcome of this paradigm shift to be? Because the answer to your question is it could be a lot of things. It's like the Hotel California. It could be heaven or it could be hell. It's up to us. But we need, more than anything else, to try to come to a consensus about what we want. Extropia says that a world in which nobody is allowed to die is more dystopian than one in which nobody is exempt from dying.
We have time for one more question.
Sure. I have mixed views on that, actually, Extropia. I think we should be able to avoid both. Okay, I'm just scrolling down. I'm going to focus on Philippe's question as the last one. He asks, what is my preferred prescription for managing, that is to say, minimizing downsides, maximizing benefits, the transition from a pre to post nanobioinfo communication society? In one word, in about 3 words, I will say mindfulness. Seriously, go onto Google and watch some mindfulness videos. I wholly recommend it. Utilitarian moral philosophy, it's my favorite. And common sense. I think these are my 3 prescriptions to manage the transition. So with that, I think I'm a bit over time. So thanks for all. I found it a very, very stimulating debate, and I'm really looking forward to further interactions.
Okay, and on to our next presenter. We have Dr. Alex Wisner-Gross, who is an award-winning physicist, inventor, and entrepreneur. He is serving as an Institute Fellow at the Harvard University Institute for Applied Computational Science and as a research affiliate for the MIT Media Laboratory. Alex's research has been featured in Business Week, Wired, USA Today, Scientific American, and the New York Times, and he's also the recipient of more than 80 national and international distinctions. Let's welcome Alex Wisner-Gross to the podium.
Thank you, Lori. Very much. So I think my talk is going to be a little bit more technical than Peter's very insightful observations. And so what I'd like to talk about with the limited time I have is to just take a step back and think for a moment about what the best way of regulating and, as necessary, making nanotechnology a controllable technological development. And what I mean by that is we, in everyday life, see so many different examples of limited, narrow nanotechnologies. And I would say that the state of the environment today is somewhat analogous to asking the question of what's the best way to establish a trusted computational environment if you're sitting in the 1950s before the invention of the microprocessor. We have yet to develop a unified nanotechnological framework against which we could encode all sorts of best practices and move safety forward. So I think it's important to nonetheless recognize that the progress of civilization has largely been driven by increased control over material properties, and in particular, we have gained over the millennia the ability to finely tune and much more recently programmably tune the actual physical properties of the world around us. And there's been this, I think, essential interplay between new properties of the physical world around us, new material properties, as well as new forms of programmability. And to just elaborate on that point, let's see, hope everyone can see this. So this is a history, maybe a little bit contrived, but I try to capture here the rough history of programmability. So starting with the first 3 points in the upper left-hand corner, you can see natural examples of programmability, ribosomes, ribozymes, polyketide synthases, and so on, all the way up through more recent examples, the development of movable type. And these are all examples of taking one physical signal, whether it's RNA in the case of naturally occurring ribozymes and ribosomes, being converted into polypeptides, or whether it's, for the example of the transistor, voltages that are being programmably turned into currents. And in the lower right-hand corner here, I've put together a list of some of the more interesting recent thoughts. And these are still, for the most part, theoretical, although there's been some intriguing progress in these directions towards what the consensus, in some cases, the consensus futurist wisdom has been regarding what the future of being able to program our physical world has looked like. So we start in '87 with Eric Drexler's assembler vision, which has which had morphed as of '92 to this notion of matter compilers, and then more recent visions of completely controlling the physical manifestations of surfaces using this notion of quantum programmable matter and a variety of other concepts like digital fabricators. So in some sense, the notion of turning our environment at a planetary scale, at an everyday human scale, into a programmable substrate which I think is the long-term goal that nanotechnology has been chasing. It's still something of a moving target, but I'd like to think that we're converging on a series of specific technological developments that will create this. And in particular, I think it's possible to fit all of these developments very naturally into this sort of framework. Let's see if I can get this up on both. Yes, perfect. I think it's possible to fit all of these developments into a very nice natural framework. So for those of you who are able to see this, I've taken many of these developments as well as many more and fit them into this nice matrix where we're basically sorting them by the nature of the physical input signal and the nature of the physical output signal. So you can fit everything from transistors to microfluidic logic to neuron chips within this very natural framework. Almost every interesting development over the past 20 years in nanotechnology fits very naturally into this framework where you consider some form of input signal, whether it's a mechanical input signal. Yes, by the way, feel free to step up closer. We're, I think, size limited, but if anyone wants to get a closer view, by all means, take a step up. So the notion here is you have a variety of input signals, mechanical input signals, thermal input signals, ranging from magnetic, chemical, and ionic polymeric signals. Oh, good. Thank you, Mel, for pointing that out. People can zoom also. And if you want the detailed file, by all means, just contact me. I have a variety of different contact points at the bottom of each slide. So I just wanted to show that as a bit of a teaser for where I think nanotech overall might end up in the sense that all of these what might be perceived as sparse developments are in fact quite naturally fittable into a very elegant framework. And so keeping this in mind, that maybe all of these nanotechnological developments, as well as a number of other developments in neurotechnology that might not perhaps seem to be as tightly related, in fact, fit into this cute framework. And so one can then ask, okay, if you have this framework, what does that say about where the future of nanotech is going? And what does that say also about the best ways to make sure that to borrow notions from the AI sides, that as nanotech develops, that we develop friendly nanotech. So we come to this notion that, again, if we were asking the question in the 1940s or the 1950s, what's the best way to ensure safe, secure computation, the answer would have to be that you're asking the question too early because you don't have a unified substrate for computing. I'm often, again, from an economics point of view, fond of also making the analogy that sometimes asking these technological questions can become quite expensive by asking the questions out of order, that asking the question in the absence of a unified programmable nanotechnological substrate might even be as difficult to go ahead and implement as, say, trying to build a supercomputer during the American Civil War. The order of technological developments matters enormously. And this is one of the reasons why I think in order to more sensibly ask what is the best way to ensure ethical nanotechnology and secure nanotechnology and friendly nanotechnology, what we really need first as a necessary precondition for that is to have a sufficiently unified platform such that we're not forced. I'm hearing an echo on someone else's side. Someone has their speaker turned on. I'll just continue. So the idea is that rather than being forced to address a fragmented market where you see lots of individual nanotechnological developments. And by nanotech, I'm referring not to the more banal definition, such as nanoscale features on microprocessors, but much more general sense of nanotechnology, namely robots or other physical world devices that are free-floating, not confined, not prepackaged in ways that they can't interact with the rest of the environment. I think it's going to be a necessary precondition to have a unified substrate so that ensuring friendliness and security and ethics is not fragmented across 1,000 different niche applications. And so one can ask, what does this look like? I think the answer will turn out to be something on the order of a universal programming surface, programmable surface. The surface in particular, I think, will turn out to be absolutely essential because surfaces are the main opportunity for any object to interact with the outside universe. So you can sort of debate the fine points of, do we want a universal programmable nanorobot? Do we want a surface? Do we want some sort of bulk solution? This is a finer point. You could argue that many of the visions that have been had for swarms of nanorobot style implementations are in fact just very high surface area to volume ratio surfaces. So zooming in a bit on this concept of having a universal programmable surface as a precondition to being able to regulate and to ensure the ethics of environmentally deployed nanotechnologies, you're going to want all of these different functionalities, which right now are basically decoupled, to be built into this surface. So think, for example, of the convergence that we've seen over the past few years in the smartphone market, and think about the implications of having a variety of different functionalities unified on a single software, hardware, and service architecture versus trying to regulate privacy and security and a bunch of other things when all of those functionalities are fragmented into 1,000 independent devices, and you sort of get a sense of where I'm going with this notion. So with my remaining time, I'm just going to walk through some examples along each of these 6 different classes of functionality. I've selected representative examples from my own research, but it's quite easy to find examples from other research programs as well. So let's take a look first. Mechanical programmability. So this is perhaps one of the most obvious opportunities. The general concept here is to take the physical world and make it mechanically accessible. So one could imagine in the very near-term future having a mechanically programmable surface that is able to dynamically and programmatically move objects around. And I won't go too deeply into the details on any of these, maybe in the Q&A right after the talk, since I'm running up against a time limit. We can discuss in greater detail how one goes about implementing any of these forms of programmability. But the essence for mechanical programmability is a surface that has enormous dexterity and is able to move around physical objects in a completely programmatic way. And I'll note, since we're still on the first dimension of functionality, that the overall intention here is to unify all of these different classes of functionality into a single surface. Point to a second example, chemical functionality. This is some work that I did a few years back regarding creating surfaces that are able to selectively tune for specific classes of molecules using their structure. And in general, you want surfaces that are able to bind selectively to very targeted molecules, in some cases even able to form bonds or electrical connections to a variety of classes of molecules. And again, if anyone would like to discuss the technical details here. I'm happy to do so in the Q&A or offline. Contact info again is at the bottom. Moving on to the third class. So we have magnetic programmability, and I think this is perhaps one of the more interesting theoretical justifications for building this sort of rich environment where we have a variety of self-assembling behaviors, and in the world of physics, local magnetic interactions are one of the most attractive ways of modeling self-assembly, swarm behavior, a number of other tropes that you see pop up pretty frequently in futurist studies of nanotechnology. So this is a paper I wrote a few years ago showing that it's possible to achieve rich self-assembly using agents which can be modeled in a number of ways that have no preferred rules, in a sense showing that structure of a very precise sort can emerge spontaneously without actually requiring even any rules for local interaction, any preference for pools. And again, this generalizes very well to surfaces that can control their own magnetic properties very precisely and very richly, using only the coarsest of means of control. Moving along, so we have three forms of programmability left. We have hydrodynamic programmability, electrical programmability, and thermal programmability. So some of these may start to become more recognizable and a bit less abstract. So let's start with hydrodynamic programmability. Many of you may have heard of recent advances in what are called labs on chips or laboratories on chips, as well as microfluidics. So this is a paper I wrote a few years ago that is, I think, spells out a very definitive vision as to what these programmable microfluidic and nanofluidic labs on chips could look like. And again, I would not be surprised if we start to fill our environment with many systems based on similar principles. So this is a paper where I show that a variety of silicon-based nanostructures, many of you have probably heard of carbon nanotubes. This paper shows the creation of what are called silicon nanotubes, which are less well known, and how they can be used for a variety of different structural purposes, for branched fluidic devices, for pumping fluids, and a variety of applications like that, as well as being able to be simultaneously used as transistors. So in the not too distant future, we may be sequencing single-stranded DNA using devices quite similar to these, where you can pump fluids, very small volumes of fluid, through these hollow nanostructures, treating them as pipes, while simultaneously treating them as switchable and gateable electrical components. Next example, electrical programmability. So, fun example here, when Google, famously has a blade server fail, it's quite common to just leave the blade server in its chassis in a failed state and use software to route around it. Right now, in terms of environmentally deployed nanotechnologies, we don't have the same ability for desktop computation. So imagine a not too distant future where if an electrical component breaks in one of your computational devices, your hardware has the ability to pull new devices out of a colloid, perhaps resembling something like printer toner, and the hardware is able to autonomously connect up to the devices and rewire itself dynamically. So this is a paper from a few years ago where I demonstrated that it's possible to build self-reconfiguring nanoelectronic systems that do just that pull semiconductor nanostructures out of a liquid that they're floating in, out of a colloid, and to using a physical effect called dielectrophoresis, actually wire up electrical contacts to them. And then even if you look in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, switch these components reversibly and reconfigurably between sets of contacts. And then if you look in the lower right-hand corner, this can be done with 4 electrodes as well. And then at the very lower right, when you're done with these components, when they are no longer useful or when they themselves break, it's possible to detonate them using a high current pulse and thereby repeat this process over and over again. So I think this is sort of a preview of what we might see in the future, where it's possible to take entire, say, cores of microprocessors, pull them without any manual intervention into slots, immediately make electrical contacts to them, and then remove them as necessary. And this is the sort of electrical, mechanical programmability and reconfigurability that, quite frankly, from a sci-fi point of view, would have been seen in the context of Star Trek's Borg or some other sort of fantastical set of technologies, but in fact, this is quite real. And finally, I'll talk briefly about thermal programmability. So on the thermal side, there are some interesting and immediate biomedical applications of having control, in particular, over the thermodynamics of water-based systems, in large part because so much biology is dictated by hydrogen bond networks. So if you can control the behavior of hydrogen bonding at room temperature, you can do some really interesting things in the medical space. In particular here, the generic idea is to use finely structured diamond surfaces to control hydrogen bond networks in their vicinity, and more specifically to be able to raise, and I'll just skip on to the next slide here, to raise the effective melting temperature of aqueous water in the vicinity of a nanostructured diamond surface up to human body temperature. And in some sense, this is a holy grail of controlling nanoscale hydrogen bond networks, because if you can do that, you can effectively treat water as if it were ice, even though it might be at room or even human body temperature. And as a result, you can then selectively control which bonds form, and this enables a whole host of interesting nanotech implications for environmental conditions. One obvious one is building out a novel set of coatings for implants and other devices that enable the devices to reduce shear as well as corrosion. So there is this interesting set of developments I would say, in the implant space overall right now concerning titanium joint implants versus other materials, and a solution somewhat like this one, where the implant surfaces are coated with a nanostructured set of atoms that alter the local properties of surrounding fluid in the human body, has the potential to reduce corrosion and to perhaps create a softer boundary layer that reduces abrasion on surrounding tissue. And so, again, not to get too deep in the technical details, this is just a chart showing that using this sort of chemical modification of a surface, it's possible to dramatically raise the melting temperature of water in its vicinity, thus having the net effect of basically creating ice at human body temperature at 310 Kelvin that's thick enough to be of utility in reducing abrasion. So you can think of this as a sort of warm ice. We want a detailed visualization of what this looks like. This gives you a rough sense, so you can see the impact of the special coding in terms of a time-averaged molecular dynamics simulation, and you can see that, in fact, many bilayers of ice are stabilized by this effect. So I think just backing up and thinking along these lines, it's interesting to think, and I'm happy to open this up to Q&A, about various opportunities for unifying all these forms of nanotechnology that we have, with the ultimate goal of creating a unified platform that would then enable secure and ethical and more generally safer nanotechnologies. I think we're not quite there yet, but I think and my assessment of the field, having done work in it for a number of years now, is that once we have this unified hardware substrate, or even the first example of a unified hardware substrate, then all of this thinking that's perhaps been a bit pent up over the years, waiting for these sorts of capabilities, will finally start to make a great deal of sense, and we can finally start to apply all of these principles of safe and ethical nanotechnology to a single unified system, such that we don't have to deal with the fragmented set of technologies that we have today. So with that, I'll take questions. And again, if anyone wants to talk to me offline, I've put all my contact information at the bottom of this slide. Thank you very much. I noticed a number of people asked me questions during the talk. If you could just resend your questions, I'll also look back through my history and see which ones I can find.
Have you done some research on liquid crystals?
So the question is liquid crystal research. Liquid crystals have not been a primary focus of mine. That said, in the general area of soft condensed matter, there are many, I would say, many adjacent physical systems, and one could point to a number of examples, especially the raised temperature ice as one example. That said, liquid crystals are a beautiful example that I do have in that matrix slide that speaks in general to turning local voltages into molecular alignments, and ultimately using voltages to gate things like optics. Question from Philippe Golding: what do I consider to be the most promising path to computationally optimized matter, also called computronium? It's an interesting question. It's not entirely clear that the question of computronium will actually make that much of a difference over the next 30 years. It's something that I've thought about quite a bit, obviously. I think that can be broken down into two separate questions. What is the shortest path to a sort of Drexlerian molecular nanotech type future, and what is the shortest path to dense computation? There's been a lot of interesting thinking in terms of analyzing what an optimal computer given a certain set of physical resources would look like. And it may very well end up being the case that there's no single global optimal solution, which has always been the implicit assumption with computronium. Computronium assumes that there's going to be some presumably atom or some other sort of stable matter-based optimal solution for computation, when in fact the little research that has been done in the area, for example, Seth Lloyd's set of theory papers on the ultimate limits of computation, suggests that there probably isn't a single optimal limit. In fact, if anything, there might, I think we will discover at the end that there's a single tunable limit where you can tune between optimal serial computing capability and optimal parallel computing capability, and certainly Seth's work suggests that the optimal serial computer is probably some form of black hole where the input is shining perhaps via some sort of gamma ray laser input in and then quickly reading out information via Hawking radiation. And so if you buy the notion that the ultimate serial computer is a black hole, the ultimate parallel computer, Seth found, would look something like a box of plasma, again, under certain assumptions. Neither of these limits really looks anything like the sort of diamondoid type computronium that many people have envisioned. So I would say it's quite possible that the closest thing that we will have to computronium might not even resemble today's microprocessor systems that are based largely on solid state systems. So the question is, what's the critical path to building out computronium? I would probably say it's going to be some exotic pathway that doesn't focus at all on the material science and is probably focused on analyzing what the optimal theoretical limits are and then appropriately nudging, if anything, particle physics and plasma physics in the direction of building systems that can compute. Other questions? Lori, did you say there was a way to pull up the chat history?
Yes, you just go to the lower left box of your lower toolbar. It says chat. You click on that and it should come up.
Got it. All right, perfect. All right, I will go back and answer all these questions now. Let's do it in reverse order. All right. So Fleddy asks, what is your general approach for making these nanobots? What kind of equipment is necessary? Fleddy, I would say my answer to that question has changed over the past 10 years or so. I would think, so we're in 2012. I think 2002, many people in the field felt that the general substrate for making general purpose nanorobots might look something like free-floating adaptations of existing semiconductor technologies, so semiconductor nanowires, a variety of detached semiconductor nanostructures. Asked that question today, I would say my view has radically changed in the sense that the most promising technologies I see that have the general potential to build in a number of these functionalities are probably, and somewhat ironically, structural DNA-based techniques. It's something that I never would have guessed 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but structural DNA has made such remarkable progress. So these are using self-bonded DNA, in some cases RNA, but mostly DNA, to build out nanomachines, to build computational capabilities, walkers, robotic capabilities. And so, for example, the Foresight Institute has a couple of what they call Feynman Grand Prizes for building out a small manipulator arm and a small logic-based half-adder circuit. And if I had to guess what the shortest path to that sort of functionality would be right now, my guess would now be something based on nucleotides. Structural DNA certainly looks right now like the winning horse in that substrate race. Of course, subject to change over time, but there have been so many surprises already. One would think that we'd start to be inching up to an answer soon. Lars Steiner asks, is there any medical area that's underway with this technology? I assume, Lars, that you're referring microfluidic technologies, although all of these are relevant to medical technology. And the answer is yes, absolutely. The revolution in DNA sequencing is being driven in large part by advances in microfluidics and in control over small volumes of liquids on surfaces. So while that isn't perhaps ubiquitous yet, I expect it will be quite ubiquitous in the near-term future. Let's see. Question is from Philippe. How would you go about programming von Neumann probes? It's an interesting question. So, von Neumann probe, of course, is this famous model for self-replicating space probe as certainly one way to colonize and explore the universe. It's an interesting question. By programming the probes, I assume, Philippe, you're asking what's the best way to build one, leaving the actual intentionality of programming up to someone else. And I would say the answer is probably the same set of technologies that will, under our environmental conditions, produce many of these sorts of futuristic, self-replicating, and fully programmable technologies. That many of them, I suspect, with only minor tweaks, would lend themselves naturally to space. And then you could ask the question of what sorts of adaptations would be needed for more extreme environments, for higher temperature environments, for example. And that's, again, an interesting question. One can say, for example, that DNA, given its narrow range of non-melted temperatures, that it's uniquely suited to sort of terrestrial environments, and that if you want a probe that's going to have to do things like melt planets and reappropriate and recruit extraterrestrial resources, that you want a substrate for the system that's going to be much more general in nature. And so again, it's a fun discussion to have. Perhaps not structural DNA-based technologies for higher temperature applications, but there are certainly many other contenders that would be quite readily accessible for doing that. Mochian asks, can graphene substitute all the present material used for electronics? Good question. The answer is not yet. Graphene is an amazing conductor. It's a record-holding conductor in certain senses. Thus far, graphene has not proven to be as wonderful as a semiconductor. So many of the studies which you may see where graphene is used for electronics, it's typically used, for example, in transistor studies, it's typically used as a gating material or contact material. So you're basically substituting graphene for metal contacts rather than for the semiconductor channel. That said, there has also been quite a lot of interesting work in structuring defects in graphene in a number of interesting ways, so that we can still recover gain and the other critical amplifying components of semiconductor channels. We have time for one or two more questions. I'm just scrolling back through the list.
Yes, you do.
Great. Let's see here. If anyone wants to ask any new questions, I think I've answered most of the questions going back. I'll just wait a few seconds for someone else to ask. So Maybach asks, through my history, what did I find most appealing? I'll assume, Maybach, that you're asking about which technologies do I find most appealing? And that's actually, right, good. I think that's actually a really interesting question. My view has changed quite a bit on this. If you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said absolutely nanotechnology is the critical path to this concept of technological singularity or some other, say at the time, I think the information superhighway equivalent term was the next industrial revolution. So it certainly seemed 10 years ago like nanotech was, and by nanotech again, I'm not referring to evolutionary developments in semiconductor technology, but say revolutionary, perhaps even free-floating environmental nanotech seemed like it was a critical path technology to the next industrial revolution. Asked that question now, I'm no longer certain of that. And the reason is, about 10 years ago or so, we were still sort of shaking off the last vestiges of what was called the AI winter, which many people feel began in the 1980s with the disappointment surrounding the non-delivery by artificial intelligence researchers of many key technologies. And, you know, it's really, I would say, only been in the past 10 years or so that AI has finally begun to deliver on many long-promised technologies. And I would say right now, we're in something of a nanotech winter that in 2001, when the National Nanotechnology Initiative was funded with billions of dollars by the federal government, it seemed, I would say, pretty obvious and conventional wisdom that nanotech was going to be the next big thing, and that this was the true critical path to all of these life-changing technologies that we wanted. But, you know, it's a funny thing relying on funding to sort of tease out what the future looks like when the funding was ultimately reduced and I would say largely bifurcated into funding for energy-oriented nanotech and funding for medicine-oriented nanotech, and the funding for general nanotechnologies has been sharply reduced. I would say that it's no longer obvious that that general nanotech is going to be the critical path to, which isn't to say it won't be important, it's just that it won't be critical path to the next big revolution, where you can call that the singularity, you can call it the next industrial revolution, call it whatever you want. And it's, I would say in 2012, it seems to me more that developments in artificial intelligence will have a cleaner line of sight to these sorts of changes. And again, as I alluded in the first part of my talk, order is everything. The order of events in terms of which technologies become mainstream first completely determines the outcome. So if we live in again, I'll make some fictional references. If nanotech comes before AI, then maybe we live in a Neil Stephenson Diamond Age universe. If high energy sources come before nanotech and come before AI, then we end up in a Star Trek style universe. If AI comes before high energy and strong nanotech, we end up in perhaps a Greg Egan style, or you can cite your favorite authors. But the order is everything. And again, it's not to say that all of these technologies aren't proceeding in parallel. It's just to say that when you're dealing with exponential technologies, several exponential technologies, not just one, several of them, even small differences in the characteristic exponent associated with each technology completely determine the outcome. Because if one technology is running on an exponential growth pattern that's slightly faster than the others, then in a very short amount of time, any exponential technology can dominate all the other exponentially improving technologies. So, I mean, if you take away one message from this talk, I think that would be it, that it's so important to look at not just exponential technologies in general. Everyone knows that exponentially improving technologies will dominate non-exponential technologies. But even among exponential technologies, it's really important if you're being forced to bet scarce resources on one or a few projects or programs, make sure that you're focusing your attention on the one or two exponential technologies that have a faster exponent than all of the other ones, because in the end, it's not just enough to focus on exponentially improving technologies overall.
I think that about wraps it up, Alex, and that was a most stimulating presentation and Q&A.
Great, thank you.
Okay, our next speaker and last speaker is the president and co-founder of Terasem Movement Inc. and the host of our workshop today. Please welcome Vitalogy Destiny, aka Dr. Martine Rothblatt, to the podium.
Thanks, Lori. And thank all of you for attending this 8th workshop on geoethical nanotechnology. I'll ask Lori to stand by and move forward the slides as need be. My title slide is Geoethical Rules for Nanotechnology Advances. The next slide summarizes types of technology which I would group under nanotechnological advances. Almost by definition, manufacturing at submicron sizes, also self-replicating submicron machines, which could be a subset of manufacturing. Also biotechnological machines, as most of these operate at submicron sizes. Synthetic genomics and biotechnological medicines, and molecular computing. So a fairly wide range of activity. What's common to almost all of these is that the technology that is implemented in one place has a very high likelihood of having dispersive effects over a wide geographic area. My next slide defines what I mean in the title slide by geoethical rules. I believe there are two basic principles of geoethics: the principle of consent and the principle of compliance. The principle of consent is to obtain prior terms of consent from such others or their representatives who may foreseeably be materially and adversely affected by one's life science actions. Principle of compliance is to act pursuant to the principle of consent, strictly in accordance with independent assurance of one's compliance. So, in other words, the principle of consent in plain language is not to affect somebody else in an adverse way without their permission. And the principle of compliance is to have an independent third party decide whether or not you're complying with their consent. My next slide aims to make the point that geoethics is a cultural universal among humans. I think there are kind of four separate arguments for this. One is that geoethics comes down to what's called fundamental fairness or equal protection. It's the notion in every society that similar things should be treated similarly. What happens in human societies is that they very quickly find even slight differences in similar things and decide that use those slight differences as justification for differential treatment. Sometimes that could be wise, sometimes it could be horrible. A second reason that geoethics is a cultural universal is that there seems to be an evolutionary tendency toward categorization. People and animals that tended to react to similar things similarly had a higher likelihood of passing on their genes than those that didn't. If something that looked like a threat was reacted to before it pounced on us, we tended to pass on our genes. And so this concept of treating similar things similarly is not just a intellectual idea in every culture, probably has an evolutionary backdrop. A third argument for the cultural universality of geoethics lies in the nature of consciousness. There is a great deal of confusing and perhaps not so confusing literature written on consciousness. But one thing which is consistent across all writers is that it involves placing oneself somewhat outside themselves and seeing yourself how others would see you. Even primates other than humans have this ability to guess what another member of the tribe is likely to be doing and react accordingly. So this idea of treating others as one would like to have oneself treated also has a grounding in consciousness. And then finally, a fourth argument for the cultural universality of geoethics is Darwinian group selection. This is kind of summarized in Sir Francis Bacon's quote, "If we do not maintain justice, then justice will not maintain us." In other words, societies that are just tend to last longer and self-perpetuate themselves, and societies that are not tend to end up in some form or another of self-immolation. So these are our four different arguments for the cultural universality of geoethics. But whether it's a universal or not, I do think it's a useful tool for managing dispersive nanotechnology. The next slide sort of begins to differentiate geoethics from bioethics. Bioethics is based on the concepts of autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. But bioethics does not seem to be enough when we come to geographically dispersive technology, such as self-replicating nanotechnology. Because with regard to autonomy, if we're treating just an individual patient, we can ask them if they want to be treated. But if we are causing an effect on populations far removed from the center of our technological activity, who would we ask? And it's because bioethics is so limited to an individual patient or a small group of research subjects that I think we're driven beyond the borders of bioethics when we start talking about dispersive nanotechnology. The next slide talks about the practicality of geoethics. We'll first start with consent and then we'll go into compliance. So some of the components of the principle of consent are that consent is needed only if somebody will be materially and adversely affected. So who is going to decide whether or not somebody is materially and adversely affected, and specifically foreseeably materially and adversely affected? I think the best we can do is to endeavor to have a scientific determination of who may be materially and adversely affected. It may not always be accurate. Sometimes it may be catastrophically wrong, but I think it's better than the nanotechnology actor deciding for themselves. who will be foreseeably materially and adversely affected. And I think based on detailed proposals, it would be possible to make a good scientific determination of who would be foreseeably materially and adversely affected most of the time, if not almost all of the time. Second component of the principle of consent is determining who it is that's able to give consent. Individuals cannot always be trusted to give consent on their own behalf because they may lack capacity. They may lack mental capacity. They may lack medical capacity if they're seriously infirm. They may be under oppression. They may be imprisoned. We talk in the principle of consent about individuals or their representatives. It's not always clear that people who claim to be representatives for others actually are representatives. You can have totalitarian situations. You could have manipulated populations. So I think in addition to having a scientific determination of who is foreseeably materially and adversely affected, you also have to have a legal determination of whether or not adequate consent can be obtained and has been obtained for those cases where there are populations being materially and adversely affected. So in summary, I think the principle of consent is very proactionary without at the same time forsaking precaution. The next slide talks about the practicality of the compliance principle, the other half of geoethics. The compliance principle requires independent assurance with the terms of any consent that has been obtained. I think here we need to have a legal determination of whether or not assurance is in fact independent. It's important for legal personnel to determine transparency, lack of conflicts, demonstrated expertise with regard to whichever party is being set up to ensure compliance with any terms of consent. So you could have a different body being responsible for compliance with many different nanotechnologies, a different body for each project or some bodies for multiple projects. Many hospitals have a single institutional review board ensuring compliance with the terms of consent of patients undergoing medical procedures or experiments. But the key point here is that lawyers will not give us absolute assurance that the independent assurance is in fact independent. Lawyers can make mistakes. Lawyers' assessments can be undermined. But it's better than the nanotechnology actor themselves providing their own assurance. In other words, having a fox guard the chickens. So by requiring there be legal determination, there's a bona fide effort here to ensure that the independence really is independent. And that is the training of lawyers, especially specialists in this area, to ensure that through transparency, lack of conflicts, and demonstrated expertise, that independent assurance really is independent. The next slide makes the point that actually bioethics is a subset of geoethics. It's a subset of geoethics when the place of action and the place of effect converge on the same bodies. When researchers do experiments on individuals, the place of the experiment and the place of the effect of the experiment is the same body, those research subjects or patients. With geoethics, the place of the activity, the creation of some type of dispersive nanotechnology, and the place of its effects may be dozens, hundreds, or thousands of miles away. But it turns out that the two principles of geoethics subsume these four principles of bioethics, as the next slide shows. And you can see in the left-hand column here that bioethics obtains consent from individuals who are weak and unable to negotiate terms. Geoethics obtains consent from populations, not individuals, which provides greater negotiating strength. The requirements for beneficence and non-malfeasance help make up for the weak autonomy of any one individual against a research enterprise. But we don't really need beneficence and non-malfeasance for geoethics, because a population with independent scientific determination of whether there is foreseeable material and adverse harm, and independent legal determination of the adequacy of consent, all render redundant the need for independent beneficence and malfeasance requirements. I mean, if people want to take a chance on nanotechnology and they have the information in front of them, we don't need to second guess whether or not that nanotechnology is actually beneficent or non-malfeasant. It's many things have aspects of both, benefit and harm. If a population wants to take a chance on the benefit, they should have the authority to do so. And under geoethics, they do have the authority to do so. The next slide presents an idea for the formation of a society for accelerating geoethical advances in nanotechnology. I would call this group SAGAN as an acronym. It would be formed by a treaty and also scientific peer pressure. Scientific peer pressure is actually quite effective in getting other researchers to comply with what are considered to be reasonable norms. People want to get their work published, they want to get their work known, and scientists could agree, well, you've got to be working with SAGAN to get your research published and known, presented, and so forth. Actions involving nanotech would first have to be cleared by SAGAN, but SAGAN itself has to act in a very proactionary way. I'm suggesting that it must decide within 100 days if the proposed nanotech, quote, may foreseeably, materially, and adversely affect others. 100 days is the clock which is used in Europe for governments making decisions on moving forward with numerous medicines from one stage to the next stage. And since these medicines are life and death decisions for hundreds, even thousands of people, it seems if 100 days is enough for that, it should be enough to make a decision on whether or not nanotech foreseeably, materially, and adversely affects others. The next slide suggests some SAGAN governing principles. The first one would be if there's no scientific evidence of foreseeable material and adverse harm, then SAGAN must authorize the proposed nanotech per the proactionary principle of Max Moore. So there's really no latitude to just sit on something over, hypothetical and non-demonstrated risks of foreseeable material, foreseeable and adverse harm. On the other hand, if such harm is foreseeable, then SAGAN must seek prior consent of affected populations via their representatives. So when SAGAN does see that, hey, there is a material risk of adverse harm, it's foreseeable based on the scientific data, then SAGAN has the authority to stop the dispersive nanotech project from going forward until prior consent consistent with legal overview is obtained from the affected populations or their representatives. The next slide takes a look at what these consent procedures might be. If national processes are available, that would be great, that would work. It would be consistent with respect for autonomy. We can't have every single person independently agreeing to everything. Majority voting seems to be good enough. Majority voting is enough for countries to send themselves to war and incur all sorts of other risks that are probably far greater than dispersive nanotechnology. So majority voting should be good enough for consenting to dispersive nanotech. If a place is not enough of democracy to provide assurance of representative consent, I think that there are other options. Public opinion surveys are conducted in all kinds of countries around the world that are not normally considered democracies. Public opinion surveys are scientific, plus or minus their measure of error. So I don't think like an actual vote is always necessary. A much more quickly implemented public opinion survey, I think, would be an adequate measure of consent. But if consent is not obtained, then the nanotech cannot cause risk in that geography, because that would just not be fair. It would violate these cultural universals. It would not be geoethical. So what then? How can some nanotech that's promising but harmful go forward? I'll get to that in a moment, but let me first talk about if consent is obtained, what would be the type of compliance procedures to ensure compliance with the terms of the consent? The consent may be, yes, we consent to this dispersive nanotech pouring over our borders, but we want there to be, sampling stations put up at such and such locations, serum sampling of the population, and such share in the benefits, just as an example. Well, the effector of nanotech must provide independent funding of the means of compliance with the terms of consent.
Dr. Rothblatt will return in a moment. I'm sure she just had a computer glitch.
I think I'm back. I
I hear you.
Cool. So the Sagan organization would ensure that there is independent funding to obtain compliance with the terms of consent. That could be done through an endowment that's part of the cost of the project. It could be done through user fees. But it should be remembered, even by technology advocates, that the compliance organization has to have the authority to terminate the nanotech operations if the terms of consent are violated. So that gets us back again to the question of how can really exciting dispersive nanotech go forward that has a risk profile inconsistent with obtaining consent on the surface of the Earth. I think the answer to that question was actually answered by Dr. Jerry O'Neill back in the 1970s when he first asked his physics class at Princeton, is the surface of the Earth the best place for a post-industrial civilization? And the answer was no, and he decided that the best place to carry out some really crazy self-replicating technology were space habitats. So ultimately, actually, I believe that geoethics will help accelerate space industrialization, because really exciting nanotech that just seems too dangerous to people to occur on the surface of the Earth would almost surely pass the scientific test of not foreseeably causing material harm if carried out in space. And certainly as one got deeper into space, the answer would become yes in every instance. And once there's no risk of foreseeable material adverse harm, then there's no need to obtain consent of anybody. So not only does geoethics allow proactionary use of nanotechnology on the Earth, protects people on Earth from unreasonable risks of harm, but accelerates our ultimate move into outer space as a place where just the wildest nanotech can run free. That's the end of my talk, and happy to answer any questions. Mihail is suggesting that we could dump it into the sun. Let's see. Eshatun is suggesting that I completely agree with I'll just type. It sounds like somebody else's mic is on. I agree with Eshatun. That it's also a good honor to Carl Sagan. Question from Fleddy is how to achieve separation, how to determine the amount of separation necessary to not affect any areas that do not want to participate. I think that's a scientific question that would be addressed by a panel of scientists who are competent in the field as accurately as possible. Philippe asks, how could Sagan have the respect of powers to be to see its rulings are implemented, executed, and respected? A great way is to get the nanotechnology engineers, scientists of all sorts, whether in the field of molecular biology or material science, to themselves support Sagan. Peer pressure is often stronger than government rulings. Extropia asks, what lessons have we learned from the public's distaste of GMO? Basically, that the parts of the world that don't like GMO suffer from having more expensive and scarcer food, and the parts of the world that do like GMO get cheaper and better food. So I think we'll just let cultural evolution end up swinging the pendulum over in favor of GMO. Maybach asks, with something on the other side of the black hole via nanotech? Who knows? Oh, Maybach says, will nanotech tell us what's behind the black holes? As in, will we be able to communicate? I don't know. Philippe, I absolutely positively will. Thank you for that offer. The answer is definitely yes. Thanks, Maybach. Well, with no further questions, I would like to go ahead and call the formal part of the 8th workshop on geoethical nanotechnology to a close. We now will have the balance of time, and another half hour for informal interactions amongst each other. As in all conferences, some of the greatest discussions occur when people talk one to each other, one-to-one. So have at it. Thank you very much for your participation. And most of all, everybody, please join me in giving a round of applause to Lori Darling for her fantastic organizational efforts for this meeting. Lori, thank you.
I'd like to thank the Academy. Thank you very much. I will remain in world until the last person leaves the conference center in case anyone has any questions about Terasem or its missions or projects.